10 medieval sourdough methods modern bakers abandoned. Bread once decided who lived long and who stayed sick. Long before packets of instant yeast and factory flour, medieval bakers were running real biological labs in wooden bowls. Their sourdough wasn't a trend, it was survival. And, well, some of the methods they used were so powerful, so precise, and so alive that modern baking quietly walked away from them. Today, on Ancient Roots Uncovered, we're ripping the lid off those lost techniques. Because medieval sourdough wasn't just bread, it was medicine, it was preservation, it was chemistry. And honestly, some of these methods might completely change how you see dough forever. Wild starters built from the air. Medieval bakers didn't buy yeast, they harvested it. Fresh flour and water were left open to the air so wild yeast and bacteria could colonize the mixture naturally. The microbes floating in the environment determined the flavor, strength and digestion of the bread. That meant every town produced bread that literally tasted like its landscape. You know, modern bakers often rely on commercial yeast strains that work fast but, well, lack diversity. Medieval starters fermented slower, carried broader bacterial communities, and produced higher natural acids that protected bread from spoilage and, importantly, improved mineral absorption. Long fermentation actually transformed the grain. Time, really, was the real ingredient. Medieval dough often fermented for 12, 24, sometimes even 48 hours. Not to rise faster, but you see, to change the food itself. During long fermentation, sourdough bacteria break down phytic acid, which is the compound that blocks mineral absorption. Iron, zinc, magnesium and calcium become easier for the body to access. Gluten proteins are partially broken down and sugars are consumed. What comes out the other end is not the same flour that went in. Modern fast doughs, well, they skip this transformation. Medieval bakers, though, depended on it. Backslopping to strengthen living cultures. Instead of refreshing starters on a schedule, medieval bakers used a method now called backslopping. A small piece of old dough was saved from the previous bake and mixed directly into the next batch. This carried over a mature, resilient microbial ecosystem already adapted to bread fermentation. Over time, these dough cultures became incredibly stable. Some were passed down for generations. This method produced consistent fermentation without commercial yeast and created deeply complex flavor, profiles modern bakers rarely achieve. Whole grain milling done hours before mixing. Grain was often milled the same day it was baked. Freshly crushed wheat contains volatile oils, living enzymes, and higher vitamin content. Those enzymes actively assist fermentation and starch breakdown. You know, modern flour often sits on shelves for weeks or even months, quietly oxidizing and losing much of its biological activity. But medieval bakers, well, they unknowingly worked with a far more active ingredient. Their doughs fermented differently, you see, because the grain itself was still alive. Warm fermentation often happened near hearths and ovens. Temperature control back then didn't mean fancy thermostats. Oh no, not at all. It meant placing your dough near the gentle warmth of cooking fires or brick ovens. This created a slow, steady fermentation, rather than the aggressive heat you'd find in modern proofers. Warm but not hot environments, they encouraged lactic acid bacteria to thrive right alongside the yeast. This balance, well, it shaped both the bread's flavour and its digestibility. Medieval bakers, they understood heat in a very intuitive way. They didn't rush their dough. Instead, they guided it, patiently and with care. Sourdough washing to reset weak starters. When starters became sluggish or, overly acidic, medieval bakers sometimes washed them. They mixed the culture with clean water, strained out the liquid, and then refed the solids with fresh flour. This removed excess acids and waste while preserving strong yeast populations. It was a crude, but honestly effective way to rejuvenate fermentation without starting over. Most modern bakers just throw weak starters away. Medieval bakers repaired them. Stiff dough starters instead of liquid cultures. Many medieval sourdoughs were thick, almost kneadable masses. These stiff starters ferment more slowly and favour different microbial balances than liquid ones. They resist contamination, store longer, and develop, deeper acetic acidity. This gave bread a longer shelf life and, a more pronounced flavour. Modern liquid starters are convenient, sure, but stiff cultures were the real workhorses. They travelled, they lasted, they endured. Wooden trough fermentation. Dough was often mixed and fermented in large wooden bowls and troughs. Wood is naturally porous and, it harbours microbial communities within its grain. Over years of use, these vessels became inoculated with beneficial bacteria and yeast. Each batch reinforced the next. Modern steel and plastic are sterile by design. Medieval wood was alive by function. The container itself became part of the starter. Cold storage fermentation. In the colder months, dough was left to ferment in cellars or cool rooms. This slowed yeast activity while allowing acid-producing bacteria to keep working. The result was bread with greater depth of flavour and, honestly, longer preservation. Today, we call this cold fermentation and treat it like an advanced technique. Medieval bakers, though, treated it like winter. Twice-fermented dough. Some medieval breads weren't fermented just once, but twice. Dough was partially fermented, then reshaped and allowed to ferment again. This second rise wasn't really about size. It was about structure, acidity and, keeping quality. Each fermentation stage further altered proteins and sugars. The bread became more stable, more aromatic, and, easier to digest. Modern industrial baking avoids double fermentation because it costs time. Medieval baking embraced it because it delivered results. Medieval sourdough was slow food before slow food had a name. It was built from air, aged like wine, fed like livestock, and treated like something alive. These bakers didn't have microscopes, but they had memory, they had smell, they had touch. And through daily practice, they engineered some of the most biologically sophisticated food processes in human history. When we rushed bread, we didn't just lose flavour. We lost methods that reshaped grain into something the human body had eaten safely for thousands of years. Ancient Roots Uncovered exists to bring those lost systems back into the light, because the past didn't survive by accident. It survived by mastery. If this opened your eyes, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to Ancient Roots Uncovered. Share this with someone who still thinks bread is just bread. And join us as we keep digging into the skills history class skipped.